Hello and welcome to a pre-recorded session of the IEEE International Symposium on Digital Privacy and Social Media being held in San Jose on the 1st of August 2022. My name is Roba Abbas and I am the Technical Committee Chair of the Sociotechnical Systems Committee within the IEEE Society on the Social Implications of Technology. Today I'm joined by the Executive Chair of the Symposium, Professor Katina. I would like to begin by acknowledging the main technical sponsor of our event, the IEEE Consumer Technology Society, for making this symposium possible. The IEEE Consumer Technology Society realized that they required a transdisciplinary approach to address global pressing issues related to the design and development of consumer technologies, and have called for diverse stakeholders to come together to respond to digital privacy requirements and matters pertaining to social media in particular. I would like to also thank for their patronage, our gold patron, the IEEE Digital Privacy Initiative, and our silver patron, the Prototype Company, led by Darren Colbreth. And of course, for their ongoing support, the IEEE Society on the Social Implications of Technology and the Santa Clara section of the IEEE, in addition to the CTSOC San Francisco Bay Area chapter. Today, we have with us Elma Hajric. Elma Hajric is a researcher in the Human and Social Dimensions of Science and Technology PhD program at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. Her work focuses on data governance of emerging technologies, centering surveillance and privacy alongside smart city sociotechnical imaginaries. She's also a National Science Foundation Fellow in the National Research Traineeship on Citizen-Centered Smart Cities and Smart Living, as well as a member of the Science Policy Engineering Collective in the Institute for the Future of Innovation in Society, also at Arizona State University. Today, Elma will present a seminar titled Digital Privacy and the Smart Campus. And we welcome you, Elma, and over to you.
So today I wanted to introduce the topic of digital privacy in the context of a smart campus and elaborate a little bit more about the surveillance ecosystems that are being developed in this context. So what is a smart campus? It's largely reflective of the idea of a smart city. Now, the definition of a smart city is elusive depending on who you ask, but generally it encompasses some kind of interconnected devices and sensors on a single network within a single area or region. And with the smart campus, we can see a lot of the similar problems that we see in smart city approaches embedded. And some of these examples can be found in facial recognition systems, in automated vehicles featuring LiDAR sensors, and other examples of Internet of Things technologies. Now, my work is largely informed by other researchers who have done extensive amounts of research to showcase the inequalities that we are seeing with systems of surveillance emerging sometimes specifically in a smart city context and other times within technologies themselves. And largely the research shows disproportionate effects on marginalized community members. And this is something that we have to take into account when we're creating smart campuses and looking at smart campuses and how we are shaping them. Something that underpins smart campus ideas and smart city ideas is Techno-Solutionism. And this is a term Morozov came up with that talks about technologies as solutions to complex social problems without recognizing that these solutions also provide more problems as a result of them. And that's something that we also have to consider when we are creating campus solutions with technologies to complex social problems. So why do we have smart tech on a campus? This can be for several different reasons. You can have regional and national trends that are shaping this. Also international trends. The World Economic Forum is a large supporter of smart city initiatives in an international context, but there's also a lot of Silicon Valley influence and innovation culture that is replicated in campus settings with startup mentalities and experimental open research facilitations. They can also be technological solutions for really complex issues around safety and health and sustainability. Now, this can look like automated technologies that call police after sensing the environment around them. This can look like health designs like apps during COVID that we saw emerge at a lot of campuses. This can look like sustainability aims in the design of buildings and embedding of environmental sensors. There are many other reasons for smart tech on campus, and some of that has to do with entertainment and sporting events to be able to engage the audience in different ways through apps and rewards. It can be for cultivating communities and for facilitating student engagement. I want to note that a lot of these aims are not necessarily to create a surveillance state on campus. I don't think many campuses see students as something to surveil so heavily or to extract a lot of data from in terms of privacy offenses. I don't think it starts off that way, but we still see that emerge even with the best intentions. So what do these surveillance technologies look like, or smart technologies look like on campus? They can look in many different ways. We see automated vehicles being tested on campuses. We see meal delivery robots on some campuses. There's also just regular surveillance and thousands of surveillance cameras that might not have facial recognition, but still contribute to privacy invasions and the ability to triangulate someone on campus and identify them, even if there's no identifiable personal information directly being collected on these devices. Now, two interesting things that I think embody more concern are ID cards, as they're used for several different purposes. I think we get into a lot more trouble when we look at things that are all-encompassing, and I think the smartphone is kind of central to providing a lot of those privacy harms and extensive amounts of personal information, depending on how those apps are designed. But a lot of universities are coming out with all-in-one kind of apps, which I want to talk about a little bit more. But these apps tend to orient themselves towards providing information on campus resources, chatbots, and safety information. It tends to be an all-in-one source. And some campuses do have a lot of consideration for privacy in these things, especially when the pandemic happened and COVID increased the use of apps. Some universities took a lot of care in following GDPR-influenced policies around deletion of data after 14 days or not sharing that data with any other parties. But some universities also went the other way and created a lot of mandates around these apps and a lot of privacy problems. And that was also seen in EdTech surveillance, which has become a central conversation around privacy problems. And something else with the apps is this idea of geofencing that emerges on a campus. Some of the COVID-related apps and general campus apps utilize beacons that then transmit and triangulate where a device is and is able to locate where someone is to send them push notifications. These can be alerts about nearby workshops, about nearby discounts for meals or sales on campus. They have many multifaceted uses, and I think that's something that we should note as potentially concerning with surveillance as well. So recently, Human Rights Watch came out with a report, and this was internationally studied, and primarily, I think, on younger kids and edtech, but they found that 89% of the edtech products that they looked at monitored or could monitor children, in most cases secretly or without the consent of children or their parents. Now, even though this is with a much younger demographic, I think we can extrapolate that a lot of these similar offenses are present in higher education as well. And we need to think about consent and transparency and the adoption of third-party technologies. They also found that 140 and more of those edtech products were directly sent or granted access to children's personal data to edtech companies. And this also happens in a higher ed case and is something that we need to also be concerned with. Now, when it comes to privacy regulation on campus, in the US context, there are very few federal regulations that are applicable in the smart city or smart campus kind of idea and emerging technologies. FERPA is the big regulation, but primarily protects educational records, not necessarily collection of data in terms of IoT and willing uses of online systems from universities. And there are also a lot of exemptions for police and authorized partners. There are also some state regulations that mainly apply through K through 12 education in terms of protecting digital information, but primarily campuses rely on internal policies. And this can be problematic because of the different approaches that universities have. One university might have a lot of caretaking and a lot of infrastructure oriented around preserving and protecting privacy and discussing privacy by design and best practices, but another university might not. Or it can depend on administration to administration what those policies look like and what teams' values are embedded into their product designs. There's also a really large question of third-party data collection. Most campuses partner with private companies, and a lot of those private companies have pretty nefarious human rights records in terms of surveillance or just very concerning privacy approaches, and how we then create campus products with those partners and how we caretake that data becomes of great concern. Now, most universities do have a statement that they legally own that data, but I think there's a lot to be considered with how that looks like in practice. And you can own that data, but most of these companies still have access to that data in order to be able to provide services like cloud computing and internet service providers, cell phone providers. You're working with a lot of entities that have access to that data, and that data can be with a lot of personally identifiable information, even if it's not intended to be. So there are a few kind of privacy tensions that emerge on campus. Just to review some of the points that I just made: FERPA and digital software, universities policies, and third-party data policies. This idea of universities being startups or open research places versus student privacy and students being guinea pigs on campus. This idea of safety against surveillance culture and surveillance ecosystems. This idea of physical and digital identities merging through these apps being used on campus in physical infrastructure environments, where there's a shift happening to how we might consider students at this point. And something that is often overlooked, I think, because there's not usually an intention of having nefarious uses of these technologies. It's usually to provide a better service or better experience for students and the university as a whole. But nonetheless, there was a lot of impact and especially psychological impact that comes with surveillance and privacy intrusions. And students do push back sometimes. One of the interesting examples, well, first I want to note that students are pushing back against proctoring surveillance apps. That's kind of where a lot of pushback happened during the pandemic, because they were marking people as cheating when they weren't, and that caused a lot of distress. And they were able to, collect a lot of intrusive information on the entire home network, not necessarily just the student's computer. And it was just very intrusive and overwhelming for students to use these apps. And then the other very interesting example, I think, is in San Diego. UCSD students joined the coalition against smart streetlights that were being put out. And this is based off the research from Lily Irani. But in essence, San Diego put out these streetlights that were said to be for environmental sensing and the ability to turn on and turn off the lights. But they had a lot of function creep and ended up being primarily used for policing. And the community had a lot of pushback because it was placed in communities that were largely brown and Muslim. It was placed in front of a mosque, and there's a lot of surveillance issues that have come up since 9/11 in the United States. And there was a lot of pushback against this technology because of the Fourth Amendment violations and just the detrimental impact of these. And that's something to think about, I think, in the context of a university structure. What's different in a university structure is we don't have the same dynamic of a city and citizen that is available in places like San Diego in this example. On a campus, there's no elected official that you're leveraging an election against, like it was in this case. It's a lot different as far as the power dynamic goes, and students, I think, have overall less power and less voice in these situations. But I do think it's something to think about when we are embedding these technologies. So I kind of wanted to push beyond just privacy implications, because privacy is incredibly important to think about. But I also think that even when we have things designed with privacy by design mindsets and trying to minimize data collection as much as possible, we're still creating these ecosystems of surveillance and having a lot of impact on the power dynamics on a campus and governance implications, what we're looking at as far as students, and are they becoming more like consumers in these settings? I do want to note that university also offers a really unique space for problem solving these technological challenges. Since it is usually open research based and experimental, we can also leverage that to be a kind of sandbox for privacy solutions and test some of the ideas that we have around best practices for privacies. There are many universities that can be partnered with to test these things out, and especially leveraging the expertise at those universities. And there are usually students in the social sciences that are not engaged with, even when there are students in engineering and computing sciences that are often engaged with and collaborated with to create some of these devices, diversifying those partnerships, and even just educating and having more transparency about what kind of technologies are being implemented on a campus would be a really good step forward in this dynamic. And it can also consider local solutions while we wait on comprehensive regulation. That seems to be a good path forward, and just really leveraging a democratic approach to smart cities or smart campuses. And I also wanted to note this idea of implementing alternative visions, because a lot of these smart cities or smart campus ideas tend to be created in silos. So there should be more inclusion and involvement from the diverse body of not just students, but you also have faculty and staff and public. A campus is really diverse for who it serves. There are kids that come to campus for daycares. There's a lot more people that are subjected to this technologies whose input should be considered in the design process. And that might require rethinking the way that we do innovation in general, especially on campus. I think campuses are a really great place to redesign the way that we are approaching innovation and the embedding of these technologies. So those are just my references, and thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Elma. It was very insightful. We have so many questions for you. Before I ask some of my questions, I might hand over to my co-host, Professor Katina Michael, for her reflections and any questions she might have.
Thank you, Roba. I concur, Elma. What a sober presentation and very robust in all of its perspectives. One of the last points you made was on design, and I keep thinking about these technologies that we're building, that we're stuffing sensors in, and we're stuffing all of these capabilities into, and then we almost buy off the shelf and we roll out, even if it's experimental. And so my mind goes to, when do we collect data, and why do we collect data when it seems that these boxes come in default settings with all of these default sensors jam-packed into them, and these capabilities that if I need it, I may be able to use it, but if it's there for the taking, just collect it. What kinds of reversal, because you're talking about reimagining design here, what approach should we be taking instead of saying, here's a box? What do you think we could do?
That's a really great question. And I think there's a lot of leadership in this from some cities and their approaches. I think it might require redefining what we think of as a smart city. I think there's a borough in New York that approached their idea of a smart city being a communal garden to solve for their problems in that way. Boston City has a Boston City playbook that kind of requires a list of questions for those advertising their products. What exactly is this doing? What problem are you solving for exactly? To really think about these technologies before we roll them out. But I think a really good start would be, why do you need this technology? Do you even need this technology? And I think it's interesting because a lot of people that I've talked to have a really keen awareness of smart city failures. And one of them being not knowing what the technology is solving for. But even though there's this awareness, there's a really big gap between actually applying that in practice. And we still have these technologies that are just built with a ton of sensors in place. And I think there just needs to be a pause at the very beginning and an understanding of exactly what this technology is solving for. And I think if we just did that, that would probably offset a lot of painful things down the road where we realize we just spent a lot of money into these technologies and them coming out of the box. And I think with the San Diego example, it was mentioned that the city spent $30 million on these smart streetlights with all of these sensors, and they were used for like pedestrian counting. And in the end, it was not correct. So you spend a lot of money on these out of the box things that might not actually be delivering what they are proposing that they're doing for you. So I think we just need to slow down. That probably is my answer to that.
A lot of these organizations and cities in general describe services provisioning as the main impetus for the collection of data. If we know where you are, we know what you need, we can better service you and on demand deliver the services and ensure that you're not off. The same thing happens on campuses. We now have the ability through third-party emails. We see our institution's email address, but behind that is a supplier. Wi-Fi access. We also see, our local institution, but behind that is somebody who actually operates that Wi-Fi network. We see devices. Often they're placed in dormitories, IoT devices like Alexas or so forth, not to, pick on Amazon, all different types of devices, even doorbells that are connected. And, you make the pertinent point that, looking at American institutions, many of them have their own police forces on campus. They're almost a law unto themselves, almost. But they are guided by organizational policies. They are situated within a state with legislative and legislation and regulation. Sometimes there's conflict, but they shouldn't. But I keep coming back to this point of if researchers are expected to do things like human ethics research for data collection, put in a form and get their studies approved, how much more should these technologies that are being deployed on campuses actually go through a similar process whereby, there is a risk identified if there are any risks, potential harms if there are any potential harms. But what other ways do you believe we could mitigate beyond maybe, ensuring that an internal review board application is put in for human subjects, even though it's not typically research that's going on campus exactly. It could be experimental, but that's just one way. What other ways could we support the deployment of these kinds of applications and services?
I think just maybe opportunities for cross-disciplinary dialogue and education, and just providing more opportunities to discuss these things before they're implemented, because we do have a lot of really brilliant thinkers on campuses whose voices do matter and who might have really profound insights into what we're not thinking about with regards to these technologies. I have seen a lot more engagement with the STEM side and a lot more of enabling of pushing through technological solutions and maybe even offering research opportunities through these devices. For example, a pole fitted with a lot of sensors can provide an opportunity for researchers to use that. But we also then have to think about if those researchers might test facial recognition algorithms, if they might test emerging concepts and softwares on the student body, and whether that student body wants to be subjected to these things, or if there's even any transparency. That's another thing with the risk here, is a lot of these smart city or smart campus technologies are not visible. People don't know how much of their data is being collected. People don't know that they're not just using the email provider, and they're instead being tracked across every single website that they use in that browser the entire time that they're logged in, or if they're using a creative suite. I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen in conversation.
I have one more question, Elma, and it's about if students or academics or professional staff on campuses or anyone visiting a campus has a question about how their data might be being collected, what do they do? Like, if I wanted to find out what kind of, I've downloaded the institution's mobile app for e-safety and other services on campus, but I'm not sure what's actually happening. And I have a question. Is there an ombudsman? Is there a IT group that I go to? Who do I talk to? My local constituency, whatever that is, the city. What do I do as an individual?
I think most universities have their kind of privacy policy outlined online, and they might provide an email address that can be contacted for further information. I know I've had to dig really deep to find access to things like opting out of all of the online tracking, and I have not gone through the process, so I'm not sure what it's like. But it tends to be very buried information and kind of the surface level privacy policies that I've seen tend to be more of legal statements that are protecting the universities from protecting the university's rights to collect your data. But I don't know that most universities have an entity that is specifically oriented towards that. Some might have IT help that can be contacted, or a specific data trust officer that can be contacted. It depends on the university, but I think there are also student governing bodies where this can be brought to their attention if there are any concerns, and kind of a bottom-up approach to figuring things out.
Thank you so much. I think I'll hand back to Roba.
Thank you so much, Katina. Great questions. And I really enjoyed listening to Elma's responses too. Elma, I might go back a little. One point that you raised, which I found quite interesting, is you mentioned we need to pause and think about the need, the purpose of the technology, and pause in that process of design. So apart from pausing, how do we navigate some of those tensions that you mentioned? So you mentioned the technological, the regulatory, and other aspects. For example, provision of services, as Katina just identified, being the main motivation for data collection versus the privacy and other implications you noted. So do you have, based on your research, any recommendations as to practical next steps to be able to understand and articulate the nature of those tensions more specifically?
I don't know that there are necessarily solutions. For example, the tension between students being used as guinea pigs versus open research areas. I think those are kind of new tensions that we're grappling with. And there might be state or federal regulations, depending on where the university is situated, where that's answered, or at least partially, with some kind of data protections. I think these are just a lot of tensions that have been brought up in the research areas. And I think we're still working on the solutions for them. I've seen different kinds of solutions, some that I don't necessarily agree with. For example, data trusts and creating another body that can provide oversight to that data. I think we're still really working on what those solutions look like when it comes to data regulation and governance. But a good place to start would just be kind of design ethics and design justice work, and following those researchers' examples for how we should be creating our environments and infrastructures with participatory models and really a lot of engagement. I'm not sure if that
quite right. No, that absolutely did. That's exactly what I was referring to that particular point, that I don't think we're at the solution stage yet, Elma. I think we're still grappling with the articulation of what those tensions are. So your answer really responded exactly to that point. Before even thinking about solutions, I was just wondering if you had any sort of recommendations, which you answered around the participatory element, for how we articulate what those tensions are. Because as you said, I think solutions will come once we have a proper understanding of the tensions, and regulation is, I guess, a key here, or may play a really big part. But until we have some kind of appropriate regulatory models in place, what can we do? And I think you sort of spoke to the heart of the issue, which is those participatory models. So thank you for that. You did mention another concept which I'm quite intrigued in, which is around the sandbox for privacy solutions concept. And you did note that diverse partnerships, education and transparency will have a part to play within the context of those that particular sandbox concept. Do you have any other suggestions of how we can move forward with that sandbox idea? So sandbox for privacy solutions more specifically?
Yeah, so this comes from in smart cities, there tends to be a deployment in areas that are called like regulatory sandbox areas. For example, Phoenix is a city that adopts this mentality of providing a very hands-off approach to regulation and being very open to experimental adoptions of technologies, for example, automated vehicles or something like that. And I think with campuses reiterating a lot of that same idea of being innovation test beds, why don't we leverage that complete lack of federal regulation as an opportunity to play around with policy solutions, to play around with recommendations, and these can be, maybe this is an idea that I'm still grappling with in my own research, but maybe we can, leverage what expertise we have locally and interests we have locally to come up with local solutions that can then maybe inform or create coalitions between universities and exchange some of that information, because we do have a lot of research in how do we come up with these solutions, but there's not really an application of them. So this is, again, just something that I'm still working on, but this idea of using a campus to come up and play around with solutions, because it provides such an interesting and unique dynamic for all kinds of people. You have not only citizens, you have international students and international faculty, you have not only students, you have very young children. In some cases, you have retirement communities on campuses. There's just, I think, a perfect opportunity to really push the boundaries of what solutions we're looking for. And if we can find a solution for a campus, and this would also be really great for any university that finds any kinds of solutions. They can be really trendsetters and known for their solutions in this very complex area.
Thank you, Elma. Yeah, you're quite right. It is quite complex. There are a lot of sort of moving parts. The complexity of the system itself, I guess, is something that we need to navigate. The second last question I have for you is more about your research. So where to from here, given all these really great ideas that you mentioned, where to from here for your research? Where do you see it as going?
Well, I am not fully sure. I think I'm working on my dissertation proposal at this stage. And I am still wrapping up a project centering on a specific campus technology that's really being used as a way to investigate a lot of these concepts and issues. And I don't necessarily know where to from here. I think I'm very intrigued and concerned by the facilitation of these physical and digital mergings that are happening on campus, and these ideas around ambient sensing and kind of providing these services, as one of the questions asked, providing these services without thinking about what the implications are for how we're redefining who we are as humans. And I think that's something that Rob Kitchen's work has dealt greatly with kind of redefining who we are as citizens in these smart city spaces, but I'm also questioning how we're redefining students in these campus spaces, because we're not just on a campus setting, it's not just a citizen-city relationship. I think it's a very different dynamic. So that's kind of where I'm at with exploring these. I'm still just very much exploring things, and that's where my research is heading.
It's wonderful, Elma. There are just so many different, I guess, directions that you can go here, from the design space to the design justice space, more specifically, looking at the participatory models and all these other great, I guess, ideas that you mentioned throughout the course of this presentation. So I wish you the best of luck with that. And I look forward to following your work and seeing where you take this work, because it's a really exciting space, a really complex space, as we mentioned earlier. So the final question I have for you, Elma, and it's something we've asked all of our presenters here, is if you had one message for Silicon Valley, what would that message be?
I think my message would be to center human rights. I think that that needs to be at our center of how we're developing technologies and doing innovation and coming up with sometimes really important solutions to health issues or to medical advances. I think we need to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit on human rights, and make that a centerpiece in Silicon Valley.
What a great message, Elma. Thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciated your thoughtful and thought-provoking responses to our question. I'd like to thank everyone who's watching this for their attention. If you like what you've heard, please head over to the link on your screen and register for the IEEE International Symposium on Digital Privacy and Social Media. And also, if you're interested in finding out more, feel free to visit the web pages on your screen to see both the in-person program and other pre-records on the IEEE International Symposium on Digital Privacy and Social Media webpage, in addition to other websites such as the IEEE Consumer Technology Society site, IEEE Digital Privacy Initiatives, the IEEE Society on the Social Implications of Technology, and the IEEE Future Directions websites. Once again, thank you so much to our speaker for today, Elma Hajric. Thank you to my co-host, Katina Michael, and we look forward to seeing you in another session. Thank you.